was really lagging before, and we were trying to struggle to work on it without. I didn't want to interrupt what Bridget was saying. I was like,
Oh, no, no. What she was saying was important, and
yeah.
I'm personally laggy, so this is great.
Okay, so do you want me to play part? You sent me like three links
Well,
to.
there are just different cue points.
Okay,
This is quite a long piece,
okay,
but it's more so to get, um, I don't know, go do what you feel.
okay. Chloe, what would you think if we ambiently let this continue to play while you sort of talk a little bit about it? Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's totally okay with me.
I mean, you can go back to saying whatever you were thinking about that was like spawned through like what Bridget was saying, but also the idea of the you were talking about this performance about the individual's experience, the voice, but also like with the its relationship to the whole, like to the audience experience, and also the idea of like voice in space.
Yeah, so this piece specifically, and part of why I chose it is it was made for like a stereo or a typical sound system, and I do a lot of multi-channel work. Part of the reason why I chose this is it's actually like meant to be played in this format, which is really great. And when I was making this work, I was in this very long tunnel underground, and the work is just my voice, a loop pedal, a speaker, and some Zoom recorders. And typically I do audio programming, and it's a lot more technologically intense. But this was like very isolated in this way, which feels really applicable to this time. But like even within that isolation, the composition and how the composition shifts over the 15 minutes is I'm finding the resonant frequency of the space. And when you find a resonant frequency of a space, it's the note that doubles in amplitude. And I'm using that to change and shift the loop that's going on without like stopping it or changing it throughout that 15 minutes. So what you have in the beginning is still there underneath everything, but without like cranking my own volume. It's shifted because of the room. And so like the space is inherently this collaborator in that type of situation. But the space is always a collaborator. And I think that's something that I feel like Brigitte through this other lens was like looking at and thinking about how we have, like, we who have been like socialized in Western civilization have this like want to other the object of space or like the object of like what we've made or this like product of art, and to other each other. And I feel like that is a really huge root of the oppression that we're in right now. And so looking at sound as this like ephemeral act and a means to like bring together people, and spatial audio in particular is a way to like decentralize myself in performance and like make it about the room and the space and the event of being. Because where somebody is placed in the room and how many people are around them is totally going to affect their experience. And that's something that I can't make into like an object thing so easily, if that makes sense. And my main interest is to think of sound as like a collaborative tool, like our digestion of it as a means to like bring together these like similar but hyper individuated experiences that we have, which is just like inherent to humanity. Like there's no one has the same experience. And like as somebody who's like coming at this, and specifically audio programming, from like an interest of like non-linearity and like non-timeline based work, it feels like a means to dismantle some of these like very like strict melodically based standards that like music adheres to, and like approach it through like a decolonial lens. I don't know if that like sums up what we're talking about, or like in the email kind of what I was like, I really connected with what Brigitte was saying, both in this context and like before, where I know like my ability to like individually create change on a large scale is pretty minimal. But the more people who I can be in both collaboration and discussion with, the more likely that like through those like connections of community that like we can get out from under, if that makes sense. Right. Or we can share. And I think that in a time where we're not allowed to touch people, and we're all realizing that these base senses, and like it's interesting that a symptom of COVID is also losing your smell for some people.
Yeah.
And like that is like an undervalued smell, but without smell or taste, you don't know what's poisonous.
Right. Yeah, when she said that was the first thing I thought of. I was like, oh, that's just so this moment.
Yeah.
But I think it's like it's sort of that when you said the thing about what the individual can or cannot do. I mean, that's something that I think about all the time, and it actually sort of has to do, Zoe, with you were talking about like this, like the tentacularity, and like that idea of like this work that can continue to be done, and I kind of just insist on it, like insist that work like that can still be done, and that we don't have to throw up our tentacles and just say, you know. But yeah, it's.
I think I mean, all of that resonates with me a lot as well, in the sense that I've always kind of worked collaboratively and worked specifically within certain communities, and I suppose the virtue of existing within neoliberal capitalism makes you feel kind of paralyzed, and the potential of your enacting any sort of change, like I feel like since the whole virus thing began, all I can think of is the Mark Fisher book, Capitalist Realism. And the line, like, you know, we can all imagine the end of the world before the end of capitalism. And I feel like now it feels more possible that you can imagine the end of capitalism. Like that image feels like it's I don't know, it just feels more in its grasp. I feel like suddenly it feels like there's a porthole or a potentiality here. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else is feeling that similarly.
Yeah. Well, like you get like a little view into like, you know, like how much would have to fall apart before there could be any kind of rebuilding. And like no one could ever imagine this degree of falling apartness, and we're just getting going with the falling apartness. So that, yeah.
What interests me is how people have been talking about this as the apocalypse, and like there's also, I hear a lot of people who simultaneously talk about like late stage capitalism, and then they're talking about this as the apocalypse, but it's like this end of the world thing. But there have been many apocalypses, like colonization of North America or any other country has been an apocalypse for the indigenous people of that land, you know? And so to think of like how an apocalypse is representative of complete change, and how there's actually some hope in that. And that's not to like negate or like deny the fact that people are suffering, but people have always been suffering.
Yeah. Well, and to like, you know, to address one of the most common like initial responses to that question of the end of capitalism is to address the means by which people are interacting with each other, and the function of capitalism as largely having that interaction happen quantitatively rather than relationally too. And this is like, you know, a huge part of what I see in a lot of your guys' work, and especially just in terms of like what sparks the creation of this, you know, the first iteration of this bureau that you're working from, Brigitte, is also like, is that acknowledgement of the need for a body to relationally find the others around it and to become one with it, to become a body politic in a particular way. And like, you know, I really appreciate your selection of this piece, Chloe, because it's such an incredible example of one voice becoming many through its relation to the space and this analog reverberation that you're interacting with and collaborating with too. I mean, these are the things when we, you know, imagine our bodies as like tentacular beings, we're imagining them in a different relation to the world than is determined by capitalism or is valued by capitalism. And it's creating a multitude of answers that can replace capitalism, that maybe allows for us to engage with it as less of a theory and less of an imagination and more as a possibility, and even further a necessity. More and more we find it more and more necessary to like relate in these different ways rather than in these quantified ways.
Well, and at a baseline, it is an action and adjustment. Like that's the composition, is action and adjustment to the action and the space. And that is like the same thing as like tentacles in a way. Like that is an action and an adjustment to like perception of being. And I am like a little bit hazy right now, so I apologize if I'm like going too far off, but like there's that, to me, seems so pertinent now, where communal organizing and supporting each other through these ways that are also socially isolated is like kind of the only hope right now, at least in New York. That's what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
And both Brigitte, you and Zoe are both in London, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are you, Zoe, in London?
I'm in Hackney.
Okay. I'm close by. I'm in Bethnal Green, so I'm in E2.
Ah, cool. I'm kind of in between Homerton and Hackney Central.
Okay.
Yeah.
I go to Haggerston. Well, I used to go to Haggerston a lot to walk the dog.
And Zoe, you having brought out your what you described as the contents of your studio and having this as your background, like this presence of these things, right? It's an alternative presence of them, like, and to have them all faced out behind you, I think, especially as you were discussing the Haraway feels especially relevant as well. Yeah.
I mean, I was actually just rereading some of her this week, and the bit that I kept on going back to, and I feel like with Donna Haraway, the way in which she writes is equally as important to the content and the kind of the poetic sirens.
London.
The poetic prose and the kind of repetition and referencing and storytelling. And I think that the storytelling for me is something that I find really important in this kind of ways of constructing other ways of being and other ways of existing and other ways of resisting capitalism, I suppose. And one of my favorite bits in the chapter on tentacular thinking, she references Ursula Le Guin and Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory, which is basically just, telling a different story. So getting rid of the kind of heroic fighter, the first tool was a knife, and instead it was a carrier bag, a receptacle. And I just found that really significant, and I felt like, especially now, it feels even more significant to think about what we can do in our own cut off, self-isolated spaces, and what stories can we tell to kind of aid in any sort of change that could happen.
Well, it's so interesting because I actually think one of the beautiful stories that we're telling ourselves at this point is the story of a public and of public health too, as well. This urge to think of the masses from whatever angle that it comes from in terms of governance, even thinking about this comes to mind because Chicago sent out a public message via our phones and everything this morning that started with the line, COVID doesn't discriminate, and then was an urging about the public health and this kind of thing. And of course, in a Chicago style fashion, it ended with saying we're going to issue verbal warnings, and then if you don't obey, then we're CPD is going to either issue a citation or an arrest. And so it's okay, so COVID doesn't discriminate, but the police still do, basically, and this is going to be an initialization of that. But the act of being in home right now, when that is accessible, obviously, stay home is a command that only applies to those who have the privilege of safety of home. But the story being told to think of the public masses, despite whatever form the governance says that in, is still a story to consider in a radical fashion, I think, and something that within a space of sickness is doing a lot of work right now to break down this individual and collective divide that we've been talking about here a lot, and even I always love the image of a tentacle being, this is grim, a tentacle being cut off but still wiggling along, and this is such a reality of a societal structure, and the reality of making do at a point of crisis like this as well.
But talking about the police, that invocation of police action, thinking about there's there are many ways to think about it, but a couple ways. One is coming from this dealing with a situation through authority, And the
Yeah.
other is like dealing with the situation through care, and like the carrier bag. Like one of the things that's great about that Le Guin carrier bag thing is it's about care. It's about
Yeah.
like bringing back the harvest for the people, and you can't carry enough, so you have a bag to bring back more for your people, you know. And like thinking about if everything at this point, you know, how do we think about like caring for the least of us like first and then everything else, you know. And it's just, I don't know, I mean, it like makes it all like super urgent, you know. Yeah, things that we speak of abstractly are now like right here, you know. Yeah, anyway, I should also ask people who are listening, if you have questions, please feel free to pose them in the chat, and then we'll address them. We're sort of like just driving forward here. Chloe, I wanted to show this other. You had another work that iterations that I wanted to also share a bit of. You said that it's a work that that you've been touring.
Yeah, it's also, the composition is algorithmic, and it's meant like it's made, that recording of it is made to mirror what it would be like if a human was doing like all of the actions of it. So there's these offsets and built-in flaws, because that's something in algorithmic composition. If you are doing everything on a timer, perfect doesn't sound human. So it was actually quite hard to build.
I'm gonna play, so it's 30 minutes. I'm gonna play a couple minutes of it, and then I also put the link in the chat, so if somebody wants to return to it.
But on the note of what Eleanor was saying, I was watching the governor of New York's like press conference this morning, because he's been doing them every day. And he spent this very large chunk of time describing essentially like flexing assistance and redistribution. Oregon sent New York 140 respirators. He was talking about keeping people calm within the state and like leveraging different respirators to different areas, and the need for like the country and the globe to also collectively work to like flex and redistribute, which hasn't really been a conversation that I've heard much of, aside from when Trump tried to buy that vaccine in Germany, and Germany was like, no. But like, it was really interesting and like actually deeply moving to hear this person who's in like a bureaucratic authority break down essentially like mutual aid in very small terms, so that people would understand and stay calm about mutual aid happening and not be upset that redistribution needs to be happening. And that also means that New York needs to redistribute resources to other people and other places.
Yeah, I mean, it at the moment with all of the lack of ventilators, that that sort of, I don't know, encouraging the worst of capitalism in like a bidding war. I don't know if you saw some of the news that I think it was Trump who kind of nicked all of the ventilators from a plane that was going to was coming from China to, I can't remember where, to France.
Yeah,
Germany, right?
No, I don't think it, or maybe it was
a lot of ventilators.
Yeah,
they were prepared for some reason.
That's just really, I mean, I suppose it's just your worst nightmare of kind of how capitalism can function in this scale of very visible, like life and death, or like who has access to the life-saving ventilators.
Yeah, it's interesting being in a place where we ran out, like the city ran out of them, and like I'm totally fine and I have no respiratory illness right now, but I tested positive and I lost my smell, and I'm totally okay, and I'm like well into the whole thing. But it's interesting to wake up every morning and, despite feeling crummy, be thankful for my health right now, because I know that no one needs to make a decision if somebody else is going to have access to health to take care of me right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that is a very like interesting place to be.
Yeah, I mean, it really is this like a side of this space where, you know, when we transform the capacity of someone to live and thrive or fall ill and die from a quantifiable amount and this, like, you know, this space, this you know, made up resource of money into a physical device of which there are limited amounts and the limited capacity to produce. We really have this this like one, I mean, it's such a grim metaphor for what the access and inaccess of individuals, proximity of individuals to capital, like, really ends up implying for a valuation of individuals' lives as well. And it's one of these things where hearing this you know, justification for mutual aid come from Cuomo, a man who has steadfastly, like, defunded Medicare in New York State, and basically whose policies, and, you know, this is, I'll go off on Cuomo all day, but a man who basically made it so that it would be as horrible as possible in New York were an event like this to come, you know, to, like, really have someone do a 180 in terms of what aid is, because of the transformation between quantified capital and access and proximity to a physical machine that does perform work and costs capital but performs work. You know, it really, I think it does illustrate this spell that's over us when we justify capitalism. And this is a preaching to the choir kind of moment, but it's such an important thing to grasp onto these images at this point in time, right? And to, you know, that's the transformation from a theoretical to an actuary, like, apocalypse. Is, yeah.
Also, Eleanor, I just think about, I also, I guess I'm not physically in America, so I don't know how involved I can be, but I've been historically a part of ACT UP. Obviously, I'm a lot of the younger generation, but they are my ancestors, and I've learned so much about civil disobedience from ACT UP. And I think learning from AIDS Coalition Unleash Power, starting in 1987, riled up by playwright Larry Kramer, and really bringing people together when people were dying. And governments did not support them. Governments neglected them, and they used they kind of entered this plan on many levels. You know, they engaged science, they engaged technology, they engaged spectacle, they engaged actions that really, you know, but we're in a different paradigm. But they also engaged the arts. You know, Grand Fury is the most, I would argue, such a significant collective that came out of ACT UP, and that we still have in terms of civil disobedience, in terms of image, and how image can be so powerful and to rile us up into good plans. But it's just, it's kind of, it brings up, like, what's going on right now brings up so many problems to the floor, right? So it's like, it's like, okay, here's like our banquet of problems. This is like our massive global catastrophe of problems. And then it's kind of like, okay, what is our plan? How do we study? How do we kind of allow this to really hit us? And then be like, how do you rebuild this? And what actually allows this to come back into equilibrium, come back into a possible harmony? And I just think in terms of immediate response, looking at historically kind of some of these things that ACT UP's done in terms of the AIDS crisis, and when it was just still considered gay cancer, by the governor, and by the president, Ronald Reagan. So I think it's really important to look at also just our history of civil disobedience and our ancestors who came out of such a strong place of love, and to really think of how this system is changing, and how then we can build and think about that, and how that's going to become adaptable and flexible to how we engage it today.
Yeah, but I suppose the question of civil disobedience comes into play when we're in isolation, you know, like how can one enact civil disobedience through your screens, like through like other means. And I suppose like I feel like what I've been doing to kind of get through this, or feel like I'm kind of trying to grasp onto meaning. I've been watching the DM25 live streams. I don't know if anyone else has been watching them, but they're screening every evening, and it's all about kind of, you know, creating an alternative European democracy, and speaking to kind of radical left-wing thinkers, and proposing ideas. And it's with like Yanis Varoufakis, and one of them, he's like, I've got a plan, like this is the plan, 1, 2, 3. And you know, like sitting here and you're like, okay, I can't leave my house. What can I do? How can this moment be enacted into something that can be transformative?
Entirely. I think I think we have to embrace the technology as the antidote, perhaps. You know, I think that's kind of the only way when we're in a place of separation. And I keep going back to Fred Moten's idea in the Undercommons, which is, I think, a really important work, because he brings up this notion of study, Black study, but he also brings up this notion that we don't really know what is a revolution anymore. Like, we kind of have to stay open to that possibility, but we have to radically engage with study. And I think because this is something that Marx predicted, because of our systems of capitalism, we're so separated, right? So like everything is in like its own world, and we're even more in our own world because we're in our own temples, rooms, whatever, or not. And in that, it kind of really brings us to the forefront, is like, how do interdisciplines kind of cross over? And how do we learn from each other? How do we engage? How do we become kind of this cooperative, symbiotic kind of organization that like we can definitely do? Yeah.
I mean, I think that idea of coming together is so important, especially with kind of left-wing politics that tends to be more divisive and separatist in the sense that everyone, you know, kind of picks up on the kind of nuances of difference between different thoughts, and I suppose like being like living through the election last year,
yeah, absolutely,
in the UK, and witnessing, you know, the kind of collapse of the support of the Labour Party in this country was just heartbreaking, but at the same time really kind of understandable, because, you know, like it was like the way that it crumbled was a complete lack of attention to kind of the fact that we are living in neoliberal capitalism, and they weren't kind of engaging in a discourse that other people were you know, even understanding the vocabulary, you know. And I think that that's also like, how does one communicate with the multitude?
Yeah. Could you, before we get too far away from it, would it be possible for you to send the link for the DM25 live streams? Because I haven't been looking at that and I want to. And then, Brigitte, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I think I saw it.
Okay.
What position does surrealism, or what kind of structure does it provide for this moment of equilibrium? Okay. I'll try to unpack that a bit, because that's a massive question. So, what kind of structure does it provide for this moment of equilibrium? I guess I would go back to Fred Moten wouldn't claim he's
a surrealist, I believe, maybe on an outward level, but he's friends with people who do. And I really do think an embracing that we don't know what the revolution is. I wonder, I'm going to read something real quick. I think I can find it because I think it's the political position of surrealism, and I believe it gives a little bit of context, so I can answer the question.
While we're waiting for you, really quickly, I just want to go back, Zoe, to your studio that you're in there, and that and you mentioned in our email before this that you are returning to painting. And I just think it's such an interesting thing that, you know, so much of what you do is performance and so forth that requires being around other people, similar to you, Chloe. And like, you know, this idea of like making the work that will be consumed through a screen for a while, or that is like work that's long term. And
yeah, I mean, I actually started painting a little bit last year, which was kind of almost like a therapeutic process. And a kind of way, because I was feeling frustrated in some ways with working, you know, like editing videos, like making performance. It felt sometimes like I wasn't, like nothing physical was coming out of it. And I've worked in that way for so long, and I don't know why, but I suddenly felt the need to kind of like make marks and see something come out. If that makes sense. And I was, I don't know, the anxiety I was feeling 2 weeks ago was just making editing impossible. I couldn't do anything. So I was like, what can I do to change this kind of feeling? And I just got like 4 canvases and was just like throwing crap on them. And I was like, wow, I feel so much better.
Did you find it, Brigitte?
Yeah. Well, that's a lot, but I'm going to read this one. Okay. Let's see if I can read my handwriting. Sometimes it gets away from me. Okay. So this is, Breton wrote this in 1935, and it's kind of around the Soviet struggle that they had. So surrealism really didn't agree with a lot of how the Soviet Union was run. And yeah, so I'm just going to read. Okay. The task of these intellectuals was to help the proletariat, so the worker, and then I wrote in parentheses, who is this now? So kind of like, how do we engage with what is proletariat? And was to teach the proletariat, to teach it what it had to be done and still had to bring about its liberation, so the people's liberation. There's also, a system is alive only to the extent that if it does not pretend to be infallible, definitive, but on the contrary sets great handwriting store on what appears to be most contradicting to the light of ensuring it can't. So there's also here just one more just quick thing. Surrealism as a method of creating a collective myth, which I think actually this collective myth comes after World War II, and the idea of myth and really engaging with the elementals, with the animals, really on an ecological level is where surrealism shifts after World War II. And is probably the most precedent thing to really think about how the struggle for revolution for the people also has to engage with the environmental and how they're engaging myth. So surrealism is a method of creating a collective myth with much more general movement, including the liberation of man, who tends first to change fundamentally the bourgeois form of property. The problem of action, of immediate action to be taken, remains intact. And so kind of like he kind of questions like, what is this action, right? So it's kind of like, okay, he kind of places it more in this realm of we need to generate what is the action, but we also need to have space to allow for us to not know what it is quite yet and to collaborative work on what that is. So not have these like strict regimes. It can never be dogmatic. Marx said this very early on. It can't be dogmatic, and all of our understandings of it have all the things that we've really seen of it largely have been dogmatic. So it really comes about this idea of liberation. And what is that? And that becomes very, I think, still is a huge challenge to have a liberation in this current society in terms of the systems that are in place. There's one more thing, if I can find it, about saying no, which I love so much. Where did it go? Socialism. I might have to go soon because I think my dog needs to go to the bathroom.
Oh,
she's
yeah,
around.
no, it's so great.
But
Can we see your dog?
yeah, of course. Bettina.
This is my support animal.
Oh, she's like, I want to go out. Okay, I found it. Okay, the unlimited capacity to say no, which is the whole secret of human progress, in order to watch and wonder unreservedly what is going on without us at the other end of the world.
Whoa.
So profound right now.
Yeah.
The unlimited capacity to say no, which is the whole secret of human progress, in order to watch and wonder unreservedly what is going on without us at the other end of the world.
Yeah. Whoa. Amazing.
That it relates so heavily into this non-event event, or the ongoing nature of this event, right? Which is, so frequently we see these, we think of like these ends of the world. It clearly goes back to like your invocation of the apocalypse, where it's like the apocalypse isn't a singular moment. It is a duration. It's a durational thing in order to move into a new period, basically. And this is why people are so obsessed with like the overused terms of like late capitalism and the Anthropocene, this kind of thing, because maybe just to inject a little bit of optimism from my like tiny coffers of optimism that I keep next to my barrels of pessimism. I like it is to say that we have this duration, and a duration to imagine and converse and to invoke the potential for of a different future. And more than anything, right, the important thing is for us to actually then, once we are able to enter the streets, to act, right? There's the potential of like this rubber band like strung so tight, and we start to see it be loosened up, and that energy being released needs to be of use when it is possible for it to be of use in that way. Yeah.
Brigitte, I think that we should let you and your dog go. I feel bad. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. Are there any other questions in the chat that we should pose before we wrap up? Or I guess if there's anything else that Chloe, you or Zoe want to address before we... I'm just so glad that everybody has been able to kind of meet each other and like have it's like so interesting to me. I think even more than I realized the overlaps between the practices and kind of how they're speaking to our right now.
Yeah.
Pretty dramatically.
I just, when you were talking about duration and time, like, I think that what's so fascinating and that's happening in this crisis is how it's kind of almost like there's a lag. So like one country gets hit, and then there's this kind of, the curve that everyone talks about, and the peak, and it's kind of this kind of domino effect of people watching, what's happening next door and not believing it's going to happen and not taking the actions. We've seen this happen in, all of the different countries refusing to lock down, which is what happened with Boris. He refused. And it's kind of, and then also the idea of being isolated in your homes. I don't know if you guys, but I feel like my conception of time is completely gone.
Totally.
I can't figure out like what time of day it is, how long I've been here. Like I could have been here for years doing, like it's, and I suppose in some ways thinking about how we can use this kind of time warp that we're living in to our benefit in a way.
Yeah,
Entirely.
that's real. And it is that slowing down of time, or like folds in it too. So it's just like not kind of knowing when it is. Like time is like stretching or contracting and then folding. And it's just like it's really bonkers. And I for us in Portland, we're just sort of at the beginning of this, I think. And so like to know, like to think about how this is going to go over a period of time. It's just, but yeah, trying to focus on being able to trying to figure out ways of using it, and also being like kind to ourselves when we aren't, I think is like the jam.
Well, I think you have to radically, engage the system and the technologies what you can. But I think it's really interesting, Zoe, that you're painting, and I guess it's not something that you're used to doing. I've been painting since I was a little girl. I write out, when I write philosophy, I have to write it out by hand because I'm just so used to the process of like putting marks on paper. And I feel very alienated from technology. But I think it's really important in this time warp to kind of activate, okay, where are my joys? Where are my passions? What is like my North Node? Like, where do I drive, and what is my gift to really like gain and expand in this time zone, like really enter the solitary space with others, but to really realize and expand what we're doing and our purpose and how we can really shift this world. So it's like, yeah, we're like ants, right? Like we're complete ants, but we're also necessary. and to value that, and how do we activate that right now? And I think thinking of time, thinking of the warp, but also thinking of maybe, Eleanor, I think it's interesting because I'm like, maybe I question, like I'm staying completely kind of like, okay, unknown doesn't mean like I know things, but it doesn't mean I know what will happen after or when this lockdown will be over, what will be the repercussions in terms of some of the policing and the governance that's already starting to go affect around the world. But to think like, what if we aren't able to go to the streets anymore? What then? What happens? How do we have to use this time to also think about what are the alternative ways to shift this dialogue and to create civil disobedience? It's like, it's a whole new world.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can return to our physical world and a material world. And maybe this is the time to allow us that reflection, to remind us how important it is. It's a material that of course isn't, that we need to some degree. It's more that it's the touch, right? It's the sensations that we need. And I think that's so important.
Well, and something that ties into like what we've been going around with thinking about leaders and the lag in action, New York being a great example, actually, but how that relates to capitalism and capital, as long as like we are maintaining the status quo, then everything's safe. And then when you remove the worker, the market crashes and things become of a different value. But thinking about also the encouragement and necessity of connection, like we are, at least how I'm treating this isolation period that I've been in for like nearly 3 weeks now, is I'm actually like making sure that I'm more and more connected with more and more people, and with more depth, because I know that there's so many people who are completely alone, and I happen to have cats and a partner. So I'm in a position of privilege there. And I'm also very calm right now. So I can listen to people who might not be. And that's something that is quite radical, is being able to like also assess where I'm at in my ability to like give that labor, but to be able to offer that labor to people, because we've been so hyper individuated that interconnection, also sirens, interconnection is often discouraged. There's these social norms about what we should talk about, how we should rely on each other, and what like independence is and how that applies to your worth as a person. And right now, a majority of people I know aren't able to like access unemployment presently, have no income, and everything's just broken. And so in this brokenness, how can we create these like little networks where we can find ways to support each other and no one goes hungry, like it's a very like survivalist thing, but like outside of this taking to the streets can also look like maintaining these mutual aid connections.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm so grateful to you all for being here today. This is like part of like I feel like these ideas about like networks and like and care and just sort of like making these webs in this time, like this is part of it for me. So I'm really grateful to you all. Thank you so much for being here, and we're gonna keep doing this every Sunday at 1 p.m. PDT. So please join us next week. And thank you so much, Brigitte, Chloe, Zoe. I know your time, it's like a lot later there. Really appreciate you all staying up with us, and it's really special. And I hope the conversation continues. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.